This is the Roots and All podcast, and I'm your host, Sarah Wilson. Join me as I talk about all aspects of gardening with some of the top horticulturists from around the world. In today's episode, I'm catching up with former guest and psychologist, Professor Harriet Gross, to explore the idea that gardening isn't always the simple cure-all it's often made out to be. We get into the realities behind the wellbeing narrative, from overwhelm and pressure to the deeper emotional connections we form with our outdoor spaces. It's a thoughtful, honest conversation about what gardens really give us and what they sometimes don't. Gardens and gardening and nature therapy as well is being promoted quite heavily as almost like a cure-all. It's just go outside, you'll feel a lot better. It's all been proven that you'll feel better. And to my mind, I just saw some holes in it. I saw some chinks in that logic. I was quite interested in getting your take on maybe whether we're just kind of overselling gardening as a panacea.
Well, I think that's a very interesting point and something that's occurred to me, particularly from the perspective of my own experience, just in terms of having been, a very busy working person and gardening being my kind of escape and an opportunity to kind of switch off from real life and the pressures of work and so on. And then retiring means that I don't have such a pressured life, but my garden still requires my attention. So I need to go out. I'm happy to go outside and I'm happy to do the garden, but it makes me think about what happens when people stop having the interventions that are being, as it were, prescribed under social prescribing. And there is a sort of feeling, I agree, that somehow just being in the garden or being outside is the solution. So if you don't have the reason to go, so you stop being on the 6-week program or whatever it is, do you fall back into depression or anxiety or feel more stressed? And I think the answer is we don't know that. So part of my feeling is about what's the impact of using it as you say, a sort of cure-all for lots of different conditions and circumstances if we don't know what happens when it stops. Because we do know, particularly with gardening, although it's not the same with just going out into the garden or into nature, we know that when people have to give up their gardens, like when they get too old or they become ill, and if they don't have resources to have someone else help them with the garden, we know that people feel a very strong sense of grief about losing a place of importance to them. So it isn't all brilliant in terms of thinking about what might happen if this solution doesn't work. But we do know, I suppose the research does show that even if you're not active in the garden or active in nature, then being able to see it is enough to at least lift mood and improve kind of well-being. But that's at a fairly minimal level, and that comes from the very original research that was done on the effect of green space and green views in hospitals.
For my mind, there's a two-pronged thing there. That one is if you're doing it in a formal way in terms of getting therapy from being outdoors, in which case I think that gardening, maybe if you're on a set program with a finite end date, that can be tricky. And through my work, that's not something we actually encourage, which flies in the face of all the people who try and tell us what we should and shouldn't do. But we keep the programs open-ended. The way that I think I would view that is that we're giving the people the tools and the knowledge to be able to get outside on their own in whatever form that takes. And it's something they can come back to because they might forget that they've found solace in the garden, their circumstances might change, they might think they're better, in inverted commas, and then sometimes if you keep that door open, they've got the ability to bounce back, and then they kind of remember all the things that were good about doing that kind of thing. So it's nice to be able to dip in and out of it, I think. So maybe that's a benefit, even if it's not a sustained period of time that you're doing it for, you've got that in your toolbox. And the other thing I think what we sometimes forget is that if we are outdoors all the time with nature, say we're a garden designer or a gardener, then there maybe is the assumption that we have a brilliant life and that we should be always cock a hoop because we're always outdoors. And that's not the case at all for some people. So that, I suppose, is a different take on it, but still important and still highlights ways in which gardening may be, like I said, it's not a cure-all.
Yeah, I think that's important. So, I mean, your point about as it were, therapeutic programs having an open end, meaning that people can still access them or access a version of spaces to work in or be with other people is great. But I think it's very important and very interesting idea that people who work in gardens or do outdoor work of that kind are not necessarily universally happy all the time because of that. It is nevertheless, you need to have time in that space, as it were, to actually engage with what you're doing, rather than if it's a job, it's a different circumstance because you're having all sorts of other pressures about, making sure the client is happy with your design, with your output and what it looks like. And then there's a continuing feeling of commitment to that. So from a professional perspective, it would be unrealistic to expect that somebody be, as it were, very positive mood all the time and things like that, just because they are out in nature. I think what people have said to me often is that, and I felt this just myself the other day actually, is that it can be quite overwhelming, the kind of scale of things to have to deal with, and that gardens can somehow, you can go out into them, and rather than them being a relief or an escape or a pleasure, they can kind of overwhelm you by the number of jobs or tasks that need doing. And when you're doing that professionally, I imagine there's sometimes a sense of doing that, although you then have strategies for managing priorities and things like that. But as a home gardener, sometimes just walking out into the garden, looking at what has to be done, is actually quite stressful rather than quite positive, because there's just a whole range of things. Things need cutting back, things need weeding, things need planting. So it feels kind of like a task and something to be endured and done like a job, rather than a means of getting benefit, as it were, even if you know that in the long term it may do that.
I think that's an important distinction to make, that when you are working in a professional capacity in a garden setting, then it's different, and you still maybe need time outdoors or in a garden space, but not in a setting where the pressure's always on and you're doing it and you're getting paid for it. Which it kind of brings me back to a question I was thinking about when you were talking earlier, which was, do we actively need to manage our time in a garden in order to achieve certain objectives? I know that makes it seem quite clinical, but if we set ourselves goals, and they don't need to be very important ones or difficult ones, but is it important that we actually actively garden or spend time in the garden in terms of thinking about our well-being?
I think there's two sides to that. One is, I think, if you're somebody who is engaged in gardening and wishes their garden to reflect all those things we talked about last time, which was, the benefit, the sense of creativity, the sense of achievement and identity almost that you create in a garden, whoever you are, whatever kind of garden you've chosen or you have, then the need to be active is probably much greater. And so it can be quite challenging to find time to just sit quietly and engage with the pleasure of the garden rather than the action in the garden. So there's being in the garden and doing the gardening, which are two separate kinds of activities there. I think in terms of professional work or even tasks that do need doing, then I think, as always, kind of giving yourself a priority, even if it's invisible to others, is important. I know my husband, for example, has no idea what I've achieved in the garden, even though I might have been doing it for hours. So he's not a gardener and he just likes the garden to look at. So you've got that kind of balance between doing a task that's important to you as the active person and what you want to see as the overall effect, I think. And you can only really gain that by having time to sit and look at it rather than feel pressurized, which obviously is different if you are a professional working in gardening or gardens, because you will always have an agenda of something to be achieved. But maybe there's a message here, which is that to keep the benefit, just make sure that the person does take the time to actually reflect and give themselves time. Sometimes it can be very difficult. And we go back then to why gardening is seen as, or being in the garden, and particularly being with other people or engaging in activity with other people, is beneficial for people's well-being. So perhaps we need to remind gardeners, professional working gardeners, that that's the case.
And thinking of people who like to go in the garden but don't necessarily like to garden, there are some people who just aren't interested and will actively resist being in a garden space. And I'm sure there's like something in there that you could kind of hook them in with. But some people just are not interested at all. I think a lot of people listening will be thinking of clients or, people that garden users who they come across or the general public and thinking, do you know, there's just this segment of society that I can't seem to reach. I can't seem to kind of communicate my love for gardening and the benefits of being outdoors to them. Is there something that makes people really resistant to being outdoors? I know that's probably a very broad question. And in fact, should we actually worry? Should we go for the kind of easier wins? Because for some people, let's face it, just gardening isn't the thing.
Well, I think one has to acknowledge that, some things are not for some people. I'm not great on mountaineering myself, but I like walking in the countryside and I like walking in cities. So those things are individual differences. People vary in what they like. I mean, some people find nature quite aversive. There is this concept of biophilia where nature is seen very positively, but also biophobia, where a sort of fear of natural and particularly things that people find disgusting or scary or, unwelcome. So a lot of people associate, probably people who don't go out into nature and feel the benefit as far as they're aware, and therefore less interested in gardens and gardening. They may actively want to control access to things that are frightening or scary, particularly things like, insects or dirt, which people do have a natural dislike of for good reason. And some things in the garden and outside in nature are dangerous. We can't deny that. But not mostly in your suburban garden that much if you've got a lawn and a few shrubs. But I think some people are less keen on the outdoors. I think we saw in COVID, didn't we, that loads more people took up gardening because they were at home and not able to go to work and felt quite trapped in their houses. But when people are free to move around and do what they like, then often outdoors seems less interesting to them. What we know about the kind of population profile of people who garden has always been that it's older people, but actually it's also people who have a space to garden in and to be in that's personal to them. So that's, another side of it. And often nature can seem quite daunting in big scale if you're not used to it and you don't feel comfortable and you're quite anxious when you're there because it's unknown. Also, quite a lot of gardening is very boring. People have said to me before, it is like doing the housework outside a lot of the time. So, why would you take on a quite heavy duty job of sweeping, tidying, etc., cutting things down, constantly having to go to, fill your compost bin, if you've got a marvellous Hoover and whatever inside and you don't do indoor housework that much? Why would you do it outside? And I think the other side of it, which we talk about much less, is in terms of gardens, but also allotments, but not just about going out into gardens and nature, is that it has quite a hold on you. So you feel quite in demand, particularly allotment holders at certain times of the year, as I'm sure you know, Sarah. Sometimes you just feel that the courgettes have got the better of you and you can't go away because they'll all have gone rampant. There's one thing that sometimes we forget and we don't mention, but does come up in some of the more philosophical, but also some of the sort of more marginal literature on gardens and being in nature, but that gardens are associated with death as well. And I think sometimes that's why people don't like nature or gardens as much, because gardens of remembrance obviously are seen as a place to go to remember people, and there's something very positive about that. But we're not a society at the moment that thinks death is a good thing. We all want to live forever. And sometimes the kind of process of gardening, which is about destruction as well as construction and creativity, can be off-putting for some people. I know that feel that you're kind of controlling nature, but nature is always going to win. So I think that's something that sometimes we forget when people aren't so keen on nature or on gardens in particular.
I know that you have studied garden design, and I was wondering about if you give someone a space, you sort of design it, build it, plant it, hand it over to someone. Do you think that people, because again, you talked about emotional attachment to a space and a garden when we spoke before. And I was wondering, can you build that emotional attachment and investment in a space if it's something that you haven't really had any input in? And I'm thinking about that kind of from a design perspective.
Yeah, I mean, I would say my garden design experience is pretty minimal, but I mean, I think there's a possibility that you can, and people do become attached or become interested. But I think it also depends on the nature of what they've asked a designer to create in a garden. So, for example, people have very different styles of gardening and garden. So, some people want to see a very controlled and formal style of garden, and others want to have something that's a bit more romantic or natural, apparently natural. And the difference in how you engage with those things as a person may be quite different. So it may be very restful, for example, for someone to have a garden where nothing much needs to be done. And the shapes and the structures, for example, are in themselves pleasurable because they're controlled and peaceful for those people. Some people prefer a very formal style, and that's perfectly reasonable. But they may be very happy with the design and the outcome, but they still may not be, if you like, interested in nature or gardens in themselves. The other side is that you start to see what can happen in a garden, which is what captures people's attention, the things like things coming out that they weren't expecting. I was just talking to someone who was amazed, really, that when you see a rosebud on a rose bush and it's tiny, that it turns into an enormous, blousy flower. And the difference that that makes in how they understand how nature works, in a sense. In some ways, you need to get back to that very basic amazement that something so tiny can become something so amazing.
Yeah, definitely. Another thought that I was kicking around was from a garden design perspective, or even maybe from if you're a gardener who's working and shaping a space, is there any way you could shape it or design it to produce certain psychological effects? I'm guessing it's quite common to think, well, we want a restful garden. We probably don't want a garden that excites people too much or produces stress. But, are there any other emotions that we might channel by the way that we put together a space?
Well, I mean, I think some fairly traditional views about design, which include, all round interest, all year round interest, I think is a key thing so that you have colour and shape in both planting and any structures you have. So you allow the brick wall, if you have one, to be shown behind the lovely wisteria or the other climbers or the hedge that you might be putting in. So there is a way to kind of attract people by the choice of planting, I think, which can be surprising for people who don't have an existing interest. But I think it's important also to remember that a lot of people who ask garden designers to come and give them assistance is because they don't feel confident about their choices. And the opportunity, once the garden is established, as you know, a lot of what you're doing in design when you begin is to talk to people about what they want and what they feel and their other interests in kind of visual or hobbies and things, is so that you get a sense of what kind of a person they are. And I think that opportunity for people to then feel confident about what is in the garden because somebody else has kind of given them a starting point is very common as a stepping stone, so that as a garden designer, you're leading people towards making a greater relationship with nature and feeling more strongly attached to that place, I think. So, yes, is the answer overall, I suppose.
And I think this, again, might seem a bit obvious, but do you think that perhaps when you're looking at working with potential clients, it's much easier if you find people who align with your own mindset? And I'm thinking about this in view of what we spoke about last time you were on the podcast, in terms of kind of maintaining a garden in a particular way or allowing it to develop in a slightly more wild style, or trying to keep something looking really formal and clipped. Would it be easier just to stick with people who are on your wavelength and go, yes, I get what you're trying to achieve in a garden?
No, I think that would be a recipe for disaster. As a business person, you have to be prepared to work with your client and try and see if you can introduce a few things that you personally would prefer to see, but without stepping on people's toes. But also, I think the main thing is to present options to people so that they can see the maybe different ways of thinking and then work through that route. If you can look at it professionally, you're doing what the client wants. And that is key, because even if it's not what you want, it's not your garden. And I suppose that's the distinction, particularly when starting out as a designer. Each garden is not your own garden in that way that it is if you are literally walking out of your house into your garden, however small or large it might be. That would be my answer to that.
Yeah, I think that there's a danger that you become pigeonholed if you stick to one kind of particular way of thinking. Even if you're very good at it, I think sometimes maybe it's not a bad thing to challenge yourself and to view a space through the lens of the garden owner, as you say.
Yeah, and I think, in the end, obviously, designers become known for a particular style. So you buy into that person's style. And if you don't like it, you won't, as a client, the client will not be enthusiastic and may not want to progress with that design. So I suppose it depends what point you are in your design career. Once you're known to be famous for something, then obviously people definitely want your services for that outcome. But in general, I think one has to, well, like everything, one has to compromise to a certain degree. So you may be able to have your style in one area and their style in another, and then work through that. And hopefully designers will have a longer relationship with their clients rather than it being just a design and build kind of thing.
Yeah, absolutely. So when we spoke before, you mentioned actually that there's been a lot of research around nature benefits, but not so much talking specifically about gardening. And I just wondered if since we've spoken that you've seen more research being done in that area.
I think certainly when I wrote my book, gardening research, certainly in psychology, was pretty low on the agenda. Although there was plenty of research, domestic gardening and private gardening was less visible in the research domains. I think increasingly it has become an area of interest, partly because everybody realised, I think COVID was a real catalyst for that, because everybody suddenly went, oh, right, okay, well, we've been doing this and now everybody should, and there's a sense in which everybody can benefit to some degree just from having plants in their house, on their windowsill. And it really has taken off in that respect. So, yes, I think it has got a far greater visibility as research. I still think the side of it about what happens when you can't do it anymore is less well explored, but that will come, I think, as people increasingly go through the cycle. Obviously, there's also been a lot of research too, alongside environmental and ecological issues, about how people can support environmental sustainability through gardening and through gardens. And I think for people who are less interested in gardening, but are interested in the environment more widely, that's also a very fruitful area of development in research. So, people who are interested in the environment are more likely to do sustainable gardening, to use less weed killer or insecticides and things like that. So knowing that is another strand of how people can come to gardening or gardens and being in nature.
Thanks for listening, and thanks to Harriet for a great chat. If today's episode has got you thinking more deeply about the emotional realities of gardening, you might also enjoy episode 314, Nurturing Growth Inside and Out, and episode 286, Natural Happiness. You'll find links to both in the show notes, and as always, thank you for listening. Now, if you're at a loose end this weekend and would like to join me for a garden lovers reading retreat at Starcroft Cabins in East Sussex, there's still one place left. I've put a link to book in the show notes. Now here's Benny with his Insect of the Week, but first a word from our sponsors at roastinghouse.co.uk. Get 25% extra free if you mention Roots and All, or the Insect of the Week in the comments box at checkout.
There's nothing like a nice cup of coffee outside on a spring day. Hello from the Roasting House. We're a small, family-owned coffee roastery based in South Yorkshire. We love coffee, but we're also passionate about protecting nature and trying to keep our footprint as small as we can. At the Roasting House, we offer delicious coffees from around the world, carefully selected from farms that use nature-friendly methods such as shade growing, soil conservation, and maintaining wild areas for native wildlife. We roast in small batches using an energy-efficient roaster and filter the smoke to remove carbon to reduce air pollution. Roasting House coffee is packed in home compostable packaging, and we know that it actually breaks down because we've tested it in our own compost heap and worm farm. Order at roastinghouse.co.uk, and if you mention Roots and All or the Insect of the Week at checkout, we'll send you 25% extra free coffee as a thank you for supporting us.
Gooden's Nomad bee. Scientific name, Nomada goodeniana. So today's Insect of the Week is a bee. This is a bee that looks a lot like a wasp until you start to understand this group. The nomad bees, as they're kind of colloquially known, are kleptoparasites, and I'll explain that in a second. But this bee has kind of got black and yellow coloration, so that's why it kind of looks like a wasp at first glance, or for many people who are not staring at bees regularly. It's black and white banded, and the nomadic group can be very difficult to separate. You need high-level macrophotography or microscopy. So they're a really tough group. This is probably the easiest one to identify and one of the most common, so that's why I've featured it, and also it's got quite a cool name. So the Nomad genus comes from ancient Greek, related to roaming or wandering, comes from the derivative is nomos, which is to do with pasture. So the pasture life was, roaming the pasture, that nomadic kind of wandering lifestyle. And I'll explain why that relates to this bee in a second. Goodeniana was named after a person called Reverend Peter Gooden, or Goodenough. He was an English naturalist and clergyman, which is quite interesting actually, because there's a few of these people in the 1800s, like some of the top entomologists were clergymen. And I'd like to look a bit more into that. But there's another guy called Reverend William Kirby, who's one of the fathers of entomology, who's got lots of bees named after him. Well, not after him, but he's named them. So these people are quite interesting. I'd like to do a bit more reading why there was clergymen out spotting bees. And I work for a church, so maybe there's some interesting link there, whether we know it or not. So these, as I mentioned, are kleptoparasites. They're naughty bees, but it's all part of their evolution and their life cycle. So what happens is the female will enter the host's nesting burrow. So their hosts are Andrena mining bees, so another bee parasitizing another type of bee. So the females enter the host's nesting burrow and lay an egg in the wall of an unsealed nest cell. And then the first instar nomadic grubs then destroys the host egg or grub with its large sickle-shaped mandibles, and then proceeds to feed on the food store. So quite brutal, as this is evolution. That's a little direct passage from Stephen Falk's Bees of Britain book. So very kind of brutal, but they've evolved to do this. And obviously the nomad parasitic bee doesn't want to wipe out its host, so it only does it to a certain degree in line with what the host populations can sustain. So how that works is quite amazing, really. But as I've mentioned before, if you've got kind of the parasite level, it's often a good indicator that the host species are in reasonable number. Otherwise, they couldn't exist, the parasites. So really cool, fascinating, mad stuff going on just beneath our feet. Ground nesting bees, that's where it's at. Some of the host species are Andrena nigrinia, not Andrena nitida, Andrena thoracica. The nomad bees don't collect pollen, they don't need to, so they just drink nectar. Some of the plants that they drink nectar from, things like yellow composites again, dandelions and the like, forget-me-nots, cow parsley, oilseed rape even, greater stitchwort and buttercups. And you will occasionally see them on a random garden plant, which is always cool. But as I said, this is a really difficult group to identify. Always try and get some pictures just in case you may get an ID off a couple of them. But really don't be disheartened. They are a really tricky group. Any pictures, please do tag me in so I can have a little look. And please do record on iNaturalist and iRecord.
You can download or listen to the podcast direct from the website rootsandall.co.uk. Please also check out my Patreon, where you can make a one-off donation or take out a monthly subscription to help support the podcast. Because if you enjoy the show, please help it continue. I also have a GoFundMe where you can make a one-off donation. Even a one-off donation of £1 helps, and I'll be really grateful for your support. So please go to Patreon or GoFundMe and search for Roots and All Podcast.